Many thanks indeed, and many thanks everyone for turning up. Let me just take you through some slides and talk a bit about this project, and we'll get to the actual artefact, the object in focus, shortly. I've long had a fascination for Robert Bruce, King of Scots, 1306 to 1329. The historical record has left us little in the way of meaningful visual depictions of Bruce beyond the formulaic you see there on the left-hand side. Bruce's great seal, the two sides of that, the king in justice mode and in warrior mode. The top one's been touched up quite considerably. It might appear to give us quite a bit of visual detail, but that's a 19th century image. The coinage on the right, again, one is aware that formulae may come into play here, so you can't read too much into these. John Barb in the 1370s wrote an epic poem in Scots about Bruce, 13,000 lines no less, and there's nothing in there, remarkably, which gives us any clue as to Bruce's visual appearance. There's plenty about his character, and other sources help us with this as well. But the question is therefore raised, does it matter that we don't have a facial depiction of Bruce? Is it important that we have this at some kind of human level or even historical level? There was an opportunity to pursue that, and the interest which the project engendered on a kind of global scale ultimately actually would suggest that seeing the face does indeed count. We know much about Bruce in terms of the charisma of the man, and that comes across strongly in contemporary evidence. Trying to match that perhaps to a facial depiction seemed to me to be a worthwhile aim. Well, everything goes, therefore, given the failure of the medieval sources, to this tomb that was discovered at Dunfermline Abbey, or the ruins thereof, in 1819. You'll notice here some visual detail. This is lead sheets, two lead sheets, which have been used to wrap up this skeleton. You might like to note that the vertebrae in the neck are intact there. That becomes relevant in a minute, and that the rib cage has been sawn through. That's relevant as well. Estimates at the time as to the height of this individual reckoned 5'11" to 6 foot. Because people were assuming that this was probably the tomb of Robert Bruce, I think there was an element of grade inflation here in terms of the heroic stature of the man. More modern estimates would put the height of this individual at between 5'6.5" and 5'9.5" inches. We have on the right the skull cast, or one of the skull casts that was made at the time, and this is the one that's actually in the Hunterian. And this is really important because all of the skeleton, etc., was reburied after excavation and examination and sealed in pitch and tar, if you like. So the prospects of recovering anything now are probably remote. Notice, therefore, that what we don't have is bone surviving, or that we've been able to establish with certainty. Well, at the time, as kind of mentioned there seemed like a real powerful psychological need to say that this was definitely the tomb of Robert Bruce. There were various types of evidence, which we can come to in a minute, which made contemporaries think that this was probably the case, but they also went further, and we can detect, examining the evidence from 1819, elements of embroidery and forgery in what happened. A copper coffin plate was conveniently discovered near this tomb, claiming that this was Robert, King of Scots, and it was evidently a forgery. This is a source which a colleague picked up from me in the National Library of Scotland from a decade later, just reflecting on this situation at Dunfermline 10 years earlier. Some said he was King Robert, others said nay. Some said, we'll make him so, be he who he may. So it reflects on that need to create evidence. And this means that as from an historian's point of view, you're approaching this with appropriate skepticism. What got me interested was the famous Richard III case in England, the discovery of the body in the car park, the subsequent research, which established beyond reasonable doubt that this was indeed the skeleton of Richard III. It was the Face Lab team, based then at Dundee and led by Caroline Wilkinson, which did the facial reconstruction work on this project. But it's worth noting that they had two things that we don't have in the Bruce situation. They were able to establish genealogically, they were able to identify a living descendant of Richard III in the top right there, and therefore they were in a position, because they also had bone, given that they had the skeleton there, they were able to do DNA testing and establish a DNA match, which proved beyond reasonable doubt that this was indeed the skeleton of Richard III. That's not a position that we're in with Bruce. So what we are doing, therefore, is trying to do the best that we can, given the more limited evidence that we've got. We're looking for criteria, because the fact is that Dunfermline Abbey in the Middle Ages was a mausoleum for the Scottish royal line, and other Scottish monarchs we know were buried there. We cannot say, therefore, on the face of it, that this is automatically the tomb of Robert Bruce and the skull of Robert Bruce. Well, I got in tow with the Face Lab team. Caroline, all this began on the 28th of August 2014, revisiting the email trail today, and they, using more advanced techniques than had been available hitherto, the same techniques that used with Richard III, were given. I took the skull, the plaster cast of the skull, from the Hunterian down to Liverpool, where they had moved to, and analysis started on that. And just to pick out some features, Mark may touch upon this next week, so I don't want to intrude too much in his territory, but we're thinking about the criteria here, which would narrow the odds and enable us to make a judgment as to whether this might be Robert Bruce or not. So the skull exhibited typical male features, Caucasoid in terms of ethnicity. An important detail were the teeth, which gave evidence as to age. So we could put this individual in a middle age bracket, 45 to 65 years. There was evidence immediately that this individual was strong, kind of working out how the muscles would have been attached, but there was also evidence here of bone loss, teeth and nose and round the eye socket as well. Caroline Wilkinson, there's been debate about this through examination of the skull over the years, but Caroline Wilkinson was strongly of the view, having examined the evidence, that what we have here is the sort of evidence that points towards leprosy. Back to that shortly. She was also sceptical about evidence deductions made in 1819 at Dunfermline, and since then, that the skull exhibited signs of healed wounds or damage. Again, I think what we've got here is people reading into the skull the fact that Bruce the Warrior King, if we're going to have a warrior king, then we ought to have evidence of war wounds, etc. But she saw no sign of that. Coming back to the physicality of this individual, they were able to deduce that we were talking about a large, strong neck and shoulders. What Caroline said to me ultimately was that we were dealing here with a figure who would be comparable to a super athlete today. We're talking about an individual of high social status, therefore, whose diet would have allowed that kind of physicality to develop. She compared this individual to an athlete like Wayne Rooney, the footballer, and this proved to be unfortunate, because when we held the press conference to advertise the visual images, I made the mistake of mentioning this to the journalist from the Sun of all papers, and of course this leaked out, that Robert Bruce, our Scottish icon, was actually a surrogate for Wayne Rooney. So that was a serious mistake, which I hopefully won't repeat if ever this happens again. There we see the virtual depiction nearing completion, and that was what we finally published in December 2016. Two versions, as you'll see, one on the left there with the appropriate headgear provided. This was with the assistance of an ex-student of ours at Glasgow, Ralph Moffat, Dr. Ralph Moffat, who is now the curator of European Arms and Armour at Kelvin Grove. And just as a plug, he's launching a book about European Arms and Armour at the Burrell Museum tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and there's workshops through the day. And Ralph's expertise was invaluable in providing the headgear, etc. here. But on the right, given the evidence that Caroline had identified, her deduction, her belief that we had an individual here who had leprosy. We included a sort of mild leprosy was her conclusion, resulting in skin discoloration, the loss of teeth, the impact on the nose that you see there, but at that kind of mild level of the scale. So that was the image that was published. Wayne Rooney was one comparator I unfortunately drew. The press reached the conclusion that this looked like Lionel Messi, so we had another kind of football comparison drawn by a number of papers. Because we lacked DNA evidence, then the colour of eye, the colour of hair, that was a matter of genetic probabilities. And Professor Darren Monkton from Glasgow helped us in this regard. We got further funding thereafter, and it seemed to me that it would be really valuable to translate that virtual depiction into a 3D object, something that could be displayed in a museum. My thinking was really about the Hunterian and the various other Bruce artifacts, including the plaster cast of the skull that it's got, and that these would have their own cachet. It seems to me we've not reached a stage where the physical object, the 3D object, is redundant. Far from it. And it's Mark Ruffley who took over from Caroline and did the work. You see it at an advanced stage here. This is stage 2 of the project, therefore. Both stages were funded by the Chancellor's Fund at Glasgow University. And this is 2019 now, and we're getting towards completion of the image, and that was the final image as created in 2019. And our plan was at that stage to move to what was then called the Object in Focus initiative at the Hunterian Museum, something similar to what we're doing today, and to bring this into the public eye. But this was at the point that COVID intervened, and everything came to a grinding halt, and the head ended up in a box in my bedroom for a number of years doing nothing at all. And it was again a student of ours, Alistair Campbell, who's an interpretation officer with Historic Environment Scotland, who got in touch earlier this year and got things moving. Again, this is the 750th anniversary of Bruce's birth, and we managed to resurrect the project and to put this head on display at Dunfermline Abbey. That was in late July, and this exhibition runs until the 7th of December. We're nearing the end of it now, and that's it. A couple of interpretive panels and the head on display there. And this was an image taken from distributed to the press at the time that the exhibition opened up. So just in moving towards concluding remarks, I want to now just go through these benchmarks and run past you the case, in summary, for this being Robert Bruce, because as I say, we cannot say this definitively because of the lack of the DNA, the bone and the DNA side of things. So in terms of sex and ethnicity, as we've seen already, there's no problem there. In terms of that age bracket, Bruce was 55 years old, just shy of 55 when he died. So he fits that in terms of what the evidence of that skull provides. In terms of other Scottish monarchs whom we know are buried at Dunfermline Abbey, the one who really fits in within the bracket, and might emerge as a potential other candidate is Alexander III, King of Scots, who died in 1286 at the age of 44. We'll come back to his death in a minute. Now, in terms of physique, we've talked about this super athlete that we're talking about here, someone who's not tall, but very, very powerful build. One of the iconic events in Bruce's life was on the morning of the first day of the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, when he was challenged to single combat in front of both armies by an English knight, Henry de Bohun. As they both rode towards each other, Bruce swerved away at the last minute, and his smaller Scottish horse rose up in his stirrups and brought down his favoured battle axe with a force so hard that he clove not only the helmet, but the skull of Henry de Bohun. The kind of physicality involved in that incident would seem to tally well with the type of individual that we have represented here. We then have this issue of leprosy. And it is something that is claimed by some of our sources that Bruce suffered from leprosy in his latter years. Now, it's not non-Scottish chroniclers which say this, chroniclers from the north of England and from the continent. It has been argued, therefore, against this, that they might have wanted to associate with Bruce the stigma of this disease because they were, as it were, in the rival camp. But if you look closely at these chroniclers, you find that their attitude towards Bruce is not necessarily one of hostility. There is respect, a recognition of his merits as a king, and ability to see the other side of it. I don't think that we can assume automatically that these chroniclers are driven by a propaganda need. On the other hand, I suspect that Scottish sources may well have wanted to deny the fact that Bruce suffered from leprosy. John Barber, for example, says nothing about this as a cause of Bruce's death. Had Bruce had leprosy, would he have remained, as he seems to have done in his latter years, still a figure at court, not segregated from society? Well, we know from our knowledge of medieval leprosy does suggest that in the later part of the period, segregation was something that came in, but not necessarily. Richard Wallingford, I mentioned on the slide here, he was an English sufferer of leprosy, almost an exact contemporary of Bruce's. He was the abbot of St Albans, and we're told in one source that in his latter years, although suffering from leprosy, I quote, "He meets with us daily," that was the brethren at the abbey, "and as his works make manifest, he has borne himself with honour from the time he undertook his office, and he continues to do so in matters both spiritual and temporal." So no sense there of his being closeted away from the world. We know that he had a deputy who helped out to fulfil his duties in his latter years. And the same was true of Bruce. Thomas Randolph and James Douglas were his trusty lieutenants who helped Bruce in these latter years. Now, heart removal. This is another iconic element in the Bruce story. We know from very strong source evidence that Bruce had his heart removed before death, and his heart was taken effectively on crusade through continental Europe towards the Holy Land. It got as far as southern Spain, taken by James Douglas. The Scots were defeated in battle there in 1330, and Bruce's heart was recovered from the battlefield and brought back to Scotland and buried at Melrose. You'll remember that the skeleton discovered at Dunfermline in 1819 had its rib cage sawn through, so that fits. Alexander III, however, there's some evidence, not as strong, that he himself underwent heart removal as well, heart burial. That leads us then to the matter of death, the manner in which each man met his death. Bruce died in his deathbed in 1329. Alexander III died a violent death, thrown or falling from his horse on the coastal road to Kinghorn in March 1286, and the contemporary sources tell us that he died of a broken neck. Now, you remember when I showed you that slide earlier of the skeleton discovered at Dunfermline, that the neck vertebrae were intact. And a contemporary newspaper tells us that when the lead sheets were opened up, the skull had to be disjoined from the body and held up to the admiring gaze of the spectators. There seems to be no evidence there of the broken neck, which is claimed, on the other hand, for Alexander III. So it seems to me, adding all the criteria up, that we have a decent case to make that this is indeed the skeleton of Robert Bruce. The final one to mention is that of tomb location, and Bruce had anticipated his death from the year of Bannockburn 1314 and had stated explicitly that he wanted to be buried at Dunfermline, the burial place of the kings, our predecessors, who are buried there. So at this Royal Scottish Mausoleum. His Queen Elizabeth de Burgh predeceased him by 2 years, and she was buried in the choir of Dunfermline. It's a later source which says that she died beside her husband. That's a retrospective reference. Bruce himself, we're told, died in the middle of the choir with due honour. That's where you'd expect someone of his stature to be buried. Under a fair tomb, says John Barber, in the 1370s. And I'll finish with this. Now, this can't be taken as evidence one way or another, but fragments have been recovered, or were recovered from Dunfermline Abbey in its ruinous state. Fragments, marble fragments of what was clearly a very fine medieval tomb. There are 10 of these in the National Museums of Scotland in Edinburgh. The Hunterian has 6 of those. So we can't take this as evidence for that this was definitely the tomb of Bruce, but we can certainly say that it's evidence for a fine tomb that existed within the abbey itself. And a few years ago, 2014, colleagues at the Hunterian and the National Museums of Scotland combined to reconstruct these tiny offerings from the past and to reconstruct this out of it, a reconstruction of the tomb that Robert Bruce had built for himself, under which he was buried at Dunfermline Abbey. And we know from the historical sources that it was a tomb of Italian marble, that it was constructed in a Parisian workshop, and that was modelled upon the tombs used to bury the French medieval monarchs who were buried at the Abbey of Saint-Denis on the outskirts of Paris. This was Robert Bruce making a statement in death, using his death as a means of demonstrating that the kingship of the Scots and the independence of that kingdom, which had been in jeopardy for much of his lifetime, was on a par with any other kingdom in medieval Christendom. Bruce was a master of propaganda. Finally, this is an artifact that was we recovered as a result of phase 1 of the project. People in Folkestone and Kent got in touch, and they had this intriguing object. If you can read the label there, it says fragment of metatarsal bone of King Robert the Bruce on the left, got at Dunfermline, 5th of November 1819, which was the day of the official excavation. It purports to contain metatarsal bone from that skeleton and bits of wood coffin as well. And there is therefore the possibility, potentially, of recovering DNA from those. And if we could get some kind of genealogical match with a descendant, and there are problems there, but possibilities there, then it may yet prove possible to take this project a step further. And there's come some reading articles generated through the project and wider reading, which I can happily pass on via Eleni to anyone who's interested. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. I'm just going to share in the chat I've shared the link to next week's talk, but I'm also going to share just a link to our feedback form on Friday Focus Talks. And if anyone's got any questions, you can pop them in the chat and I'll read them out. I just have one just off the back of that that last slide about the metatarsal fragments in Folkestone. How did they end up in Folkestone? Do we know?
Well, we're not very sure. There was a very nice couple who contacted me. This was after the virtual depiction was published in early December 2019, and it was in their possession. They'd done a bit of research within the family tree, which possibly, there was a potential connection with personnel who may have been involved at Dunfermline in 1819. As mentioned earlier, there were those at the time who were desperate to prove that this was Bruce. Massive publicity. It looks as if a bit of a tourist industry got going, if you like, in generating artifacts. You can imagine that there was a kind of a black market in these, or money perhaps to be made out of these. So objects like this one needs to approach with due skepticism. At the same time, it kind of looks reasonably convincing in its appearance. The date is absolutely correct as well, so we wouldn't want to dismiss this either. The problem that we face in taking it any further, the wood is interesting because carbon-14 dating would give us, some kind of sense of date fix there. It might help in ruling out some of the potential candidates apart from Bruce. Earlier kings of Scots, for example, if it could be proved that the wood for the coffin dated later than the 12th century. The bone brings us back to the question of descendants, and whereas Richard III, there was cast iron evidence, they could use genealogy to establish, to track down a living descendant. It's a bit trickier in the case of Bruce, and there are descendants out there today. This comes through an illegitimate line. Bruce had, apart from his legitimate children, we know that he had 5 children out of wedlock. So there are issues there. DNA testing might give us the magic bullet, and if we got a match with that lineage, then I think that would push matters over the line. But it's perfectly possible that it would reveal nothing. You wouldn't get anything, and that wouldn't prove matters one way or another. Either that this DNA is not Bruce, or that those descendants out there at the present day are not descendants of Bruce. So we're still in shakier ground, I think, than potentially than the Richard III scenario.
Thank you. So I know the head has been on display for a few months now, hasn't it, at Dunfermline Abbey, and that's that display is coming to a close in December. I just wondered, since that's happened, what the reception and the response has been, whether you can shed some light on that.
The response has been very good. The summer season, certainly. I mean, Dunfermline Abbey is it's on the kind of well-established tourist trail. The cruise liners that come into Edinburgh, and those who disembark from them, there's a kind of well-established trail which takes in Dunfermline Abbey. So it's a well-visited site in itself. But by all accounts, there's been a lot of local interest in it as well. So we're very pleased with the response. It comes to an end on the 7th of December. I'll be doing a talk there next week, tomorrow, St Andrew's Day, just to mark the point at which the exhibition is coming to an end. That'll be in the parish church there, which is situated where the choir of the medieval abbey would once have been, and therefore is where Bruce and other Scottish monarchs, Bruce and his queen indeed, were buried. And then it'll come back to the Hunterian. It's a Hunterian artifact, and we'll see what happens. I'm hoping that we might be able to do more in terms of perhaps getting it on public display here, but that's something to be discussed.
Brilliant, thank you, Martin. I just wondered, obviously as a lecturer in history, I wondered what kind of influence or impact a project like this maybe has on teaching of history, and how this has been brought into teaching since this project started.
Yeah, it's a good question. And at the point when we did the first phase, 2016, I was actually teaching I teach an honours course on the First War of Independence with Bruce at its centre. And I can remember, I suspect this might not be allowed now, Elaine, by the Hunterian, but we actually had the plaster cast of the skull down the front at the first lecture. But we all put a camera crew present because a documentary was done. This went out on BBC Alapa, called Ciaran and Ree, the Head of the King. And that followed the process of the making of the virtual depiction, and they were filming at that first lecture as well. And I do make use of it. I think that beginning Bruce's life at the end, or what appeared to be the end, with his death and his funeral, is actually quite a powerful means of understanding the man and the mentality of the man. I mentioned the fact that the tomb itself was Bruce sending out a very explicit message, even in death. It's the idea of Bruce transcending death, something that was no barrier to him. He was intending to continue his life's work, or the work he'd commenced in 1306 when he became King of Scots, of asserting the independence of the kingdom and its place at the top table, if you like, in medieval Europe. His tomb, the arrangements made for what covered his body in death, was an explicit statement of that, but no less was the heart burial. What Bruce, I think, was intending. This is a kind of fusion of personal piety. We know that Bruce wanted to go and crusade. He was a pious man. We know of his veneration for particular saints. We know that he'd long desired to go and crusade. That hadn't been possible given the demands of the day job at home, but he wanted that fulfilled in death. But there was also the propaganda dimension to be gained from the fact that his heart went on this kind of tour across Europe, if you like, on its way to its envisaged ultimate destination of the Holy Land. And this was again all about sending out messages to other kingdoms, other polities, and to the papacy, indeed, that Bruce was, as it were, still very much alive and continuing to assert the status of the kingship of the Scots.
Ian, thank you, Martin. Just before we finish, I think I'll have one more question, and then we'll end for today. I just wondered, we spoke a bit about the question around whether he had leprosy or not. I wonder if during this project, if there's been any other revelations or key surprises and things that have come up that you maybe weren't aware of.
Yes, well, doing the research for the academic articles, the scholarly articles in the wake of publishing the depiction, that was quite revealing for me, I must say, as far as this was concerned. There's some good scholarship out there, not really for Scotland, the evidence being poorer, but certainly for England and other medieval kingdoms about leprosy, and it was interesting to come across that case of Richard Wallingford, who's almost an exact contemporary, as I said, and who, although suffering from leprosy, was not separated from society. He was able to continue fulfilling his official duties. He was kind of part of the collective, and that appears to be what happened with Bruce as well. That had been an argument advanced against leprosy in Bruce's case, that you would expect this to happen. So I think that was an interesting revelation, just coming out of deeper research into the matter. And just looking at the chronicle evidence, I think that I think it bore out my own feeling that those chroniclers coming from out with Scotland were not necessarily knee-jerk hostile to Bruce, even if they were coming from the north of England. Indeed, that they respected Bruce. They could recognise the real deal in terms of kingship when they saw it. So that was a really interesting exercise just to balance up the evidence there. And I think the silence of the Scottish sources, or the fact that John Barber is more disposed to say that Bruce's death was brought about by a recurrence of an illness he suffered much earlier in his reign when he was a king out in the heather, when not only the English armies but Scottish opponents were in pursuit of him, and he went down with something that flattened him for a number of months. Barber claims that it was a recurrence of this which killed him, but I think that it's the Scottish sources here which I think we can be more suspicious of, really. So they seem to me to have a stronger motive for denying leprosy than the other sources have for asserting it.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you for today's talk. It's been great, and hopefully we can look forward to more advancements in the next phase of this project. I did share in the chat the link to next week's talk next Friday, where we'll be joined by Mark Ruffley from FaceLab for the second part in this edition of talks on the Robert the Bruce model. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you, Martin. And I hope you all have a lovely weekend when it comes to it. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.